Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus told his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with them for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. Going out about 9 o'clock, the landowner saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You too go into my vineyard, and I will give you what is just." So they went off. And he went out again around noon, and around 3 o'clock, and did likewise. Going out about 5 o'clock, the landowner found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They answered, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You too go into my vineyard." When it was evening, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Summon the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and ending with the first." When those who had started about 5 o'clock came, each received the usual daily wage. So when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also got the usual wage. And on receiving it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who bore the day's burden and the heat." He said to one of them in reply, "My friend, I am not cheating you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous? Thus the last will be first, and the first will be last." My friends, the gospel of the Lord. Just imagine that there are 4 houses on your street. You own the house on the corner. It's valued at $400,000. The house next to you is valued at $300,000. The third house is valued at $200,000. And the last house is valued at $100,000. Now imagine one of your children coming to you one day and saying, "Mommy, Daddy, would you sell our house if someone offered you $500,000? And you replied, I would jump for joy and I would sell it on the spot." Well, that's exactly what happened. Someone bought your house for $500,000. You're ecstatic. But then the next day, you learn that the other owners on your street sold their houses also. Yes, the same buyer. And then comes the thunderbolt. They each got $500,000 for their homes. Well, you're not feeling good about all of this, so you call the buyer and ask for an explanation. Their response, "Did I cheat you? Didn't I give you $100,000 more than your house was valued at? Are you jealous because I'm generous?" This little scenario puts Jesus' parable from today's gospel in a modern, easier to understand setting for us. Jesus' parable does not seem to make a great deal of sense by the standards of how today's labor market works. The parable is so much at odds with today's ways of doing things. And it probably doesn't sit well with too many of us. And it's understandable if we have a kind of a negative reaction to it. But the parable isn't about today's labor market, but it is about today's life reality. Now, it's important to understand the context of Jesus' parable. The story reflects the conditions of rural Galilee at the time of Jesus, and actually the reality in many parts of the world even to this day. I saw it myself in Africa one time. We have men sitting in the market square, hoping that some wealthy landowner will come along and give them a day's wage so that they can feed their family. That was the reality. The landowner was just to those he hired at the beginning of the day. He agreed to pay them a denarius for a day's work in his vineyard, which was the equivalent at the time to a fair day's wage. Each time, as we heard in the story, that this landowner went out, he found more men hoping to get some work, and he hired them for the number of hours of the day still remaining. At the end of the day, he gave everyone a day's wage. He would have known that anything less would not have enabled the worker to feed his family for the day. The landlord was just to those who worked all day. It's just that he was extremely generous to those who had worked a few hours, and in some cases, just 1 hour. But that's not the way we do things, one might say. Giving the same wage for 12 hours of work as for 1 hour of work, paying the same price for all 4 houses, even though mine is worth more. There's something wrong. We don't feel good about either situation. But there's one important line in today's gospel story that explains. It's Jesus' opening to the story. He started off, he said, "The kingdom of God is like a landowner," and he continued. When we hear the kingdom of God mentioned, there's a tendency to think of life beyond this earthly life. That's not what's meant here. Jesus is really talking about the reign of God, the way things work in God's realm, when things are being done in God's way. And that has as much to do with this life as with the next. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make. In this parable, Jesus was trying to give us a little glimpse of the ways of God. They're very different from ours. The prophet Isaiah mentioned it in today's first reading when he said, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, says God. My ways, not your ways." And Jesus wants God's ways to prevail here on earth. Jesus told parables about justice. He told parables about fairness. But this isn't one of them. This parable is about God's love and God's lavish giving. And we, you and I, we are the benefactors, the receivers of that giving. God's giving isn't parceled out on the basis of what we have earned. Thanks be to God. God is extremely giving to us and blessing us, and it has nothing to do with what we have done or not done. It has to do with God's incredible love for us and God's lavishness. How we hear this parable will depend to a large extent on whom we identify with in the story. If we identify with the men who worked all day, We'll be tempted to feel resentful at God's generosity to those whom we consider less deserving. But if we identify with those who are called into the vineyard at the end of the day, we will allow ourselves to realize God's incredible generosity. We are all undeserving, and yet God continues to bless and grace us every day if we have eyes to see, if we look for God's hand at work in our lives and in our world. So to finish, I ask myself, so would I be unhappy that the others received $500,000 for their homes also? Am I unhappy when those who worked just 1 hour received the same wage as those who worked all day? Or am I happy that the buyer, the landowner, were generous? What about you? Keep in mind, we're the ones who worked the 1, the 2, the 3 hours. We're the owners of the $100,000 homes. God is the buyer. God is the landowner.